parallel and perpendicular lines, which is page 13 of your notes. So we're going to talk about graphing parallel and perpendicular lines and writing equations for those lines. So to start with, what is a parallel line? Parallel lines are lines that are in the same plane but have no points in common. They do not intersect. Basically, they run side by side and they'll never intersect. And two lines are parallel. What we're going to look at in this section is the slope. And two lines are parallel if they have the same slope. So if you're trying to compare two lines, you don't even need a picture to determine if they're parallel. You're going to look at the slope, and if the slope is the same, then the lines are parallel. And then just to note, vertical lines are parallel to all other vertical lines just because vertical lines have undefined slope, so that's going to be hard to tell. But just so you can see that vertical lines are always parallel to other vertical lines. So, example 1, identify which lines are parallel. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the slopes of all these lines and see which lines have the same slope. So let's start with the first one. What's the slope of that line? The slope is 3/4. How about the second one? The slope is 0. Remember the Hoy Vux that we did? If you have just y equals a number, there's no x there, the slope is 0. How about the third one? What's the slope? That's 3/4. And then the fourth one? Our slope is 0. Okay, so which two lines are parallel? Well, to start, we have these two lines are parallel to each other because they both have a slope of 3/4. And then there's another set of parallel lines. Yeah, the y equals 2 and the y equals -3 are parallel to each other because they both have a slope of 0. So that was example 1. Example 2, we'll do this again just so we can go over it again. So in example 2, identify the lines that are parallel, and once again we need to do the slopes. So in the first one, what's the slope? The slope is 3. In the second one, what's the slope? The slope is -1/2. In the third one, what's the slope? Now in the third one, we actually can't tell the slope because it's not in y equals form. Remember, if it's not solved for y, we can't tell the slope unless we solve for y. So we actually need to do that right now. So let's solve this equation. What am I going to do first? The first thing I'm going to do is subtract x from both sides. Okay, I'm going to move the x over. And then what will that give us? That will give us 2y equals -4 minus x. And now what do I do to solve the equation? I'm going to divide both sides by 2. Okay, and what we get is just y equals -4 divided by 2 is what? And then -x divided by 2. Now, -x divided by 2, remember that's 1, so I'm going to write that as 1/2. So in the end, when we divide by 2, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and then 1 divided by 2 is -1/2 x. So what's the slope of that line now that we have y by itself? The slope is -1/2. Okay. And then the last one is y by itself. No, so we got to solve for y first. So what's the first thing we're going to do to solve this equation? Well, the first thing you do when you solve an equation is that you see you can distribute something right here. So we're going to distribute that 3. So that gives us y minus 5 equals 3x, and then 1 times 3 is 3, so -3. Now what am I going to do to get y by itself? I'm going to add 5 to both sides, and when I add the 5 over here, I'm going to add it to the -3 because 5 doesn't have an x, and neither does 3. I wouldn't add it to the 3x because then it wouldn't be like terms. So now y is by itself, 3x stays the same, and now we just got to figure out what -3 plus 5 is. So what's -3 plus 5? That's going to give us +2. And now y is by itself, so now we can see what is the slope of that line. Slope of that line is 3. And now we need to determine which two lines are parallel. So what are two lines that you see that are parallel? They have the same slope. We'll start with the first one and the last one. Both have a slope of 3. So they're parallel to each other. And then what other two lines are parallel? The second one and the third one are parallel to each other because they both have a slope of 1/2. So now you're going to do this, and you're going to identify which lines are parallel to each other, and then come check your answers. All right, now that your answers should be checked for the parallel lines up here. You should have come up to one of us and checked your answers. Now we're going to do perpendicular lines. So to start with, perpendicular lines are lines that intersect at right angles. So they're going to create a 90-degree angle when they intersect. And remember, we're going to talk about the slopes. And the slopes with perpendicular lines, two lines are perpendicular if and only if the product of their slope is -1. So basically, if you take the slopes and multiply them, you should get -1. Now, there's an easier way to do this. You could just do opposite reciprocals. So basically, if the slopes are opposite reciprocals of each other, they're perpendicular. Opposite meaning the signs are different, so one's going to be positive, one's going to be negative. And reciprocals means that if you flip the fraction for one of them, you'll get the same answer as the other one. Okay, so reciprocal meaning that the fractions are flipped. Okay, and then once again, because of the vertical lines being undefined, there's just a little note here saying that if you have a vertical line, it's going to be perpendicular to a horizontal line. So on the next page, a few examples. Okay, identify which lines are perpendicular. So the first line, what is the slope of that? That's another Hoy-Vux. Remember Hoy-Vux, and this is Vux, so the slope is undefined. Whenever you have an x equals, slope is undefined. How about the second one? That is a slope of 0. Remember, if it's just y equals, it has a slope of 0. How about the third one? That's a slope of -4. And then the fourth one, we don't have y by itself, so we have to do that. So let's solve for y. What's the first thing I'm going to do? First thing I'm going to do is distribute that 1/4. So I get y plus 2 equals 1/4 x, and then 1 times 1/4 is 1/4. And now what am I going to do to get y by itself? I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. Okay, and I subtracted 2 from the 1/4 without the x, because 2 doesn't have an x. And I end up getting y equals, well, the x stays the same, 1/4. And then 1/4 minus 2 actually gives me -7/4. Okay, so minus instead of plus now, because it's negative, -7/4. Now what's the slope of that line? The slope is 1/4. So identify which lines are perpendicular. Well, let's start with the first one. That's a vertical line. And remember, vertical lines are perpendicular to horizontal lines. So which horizontal line do you see? The y equals, yes. So these two are going to be perpendicular to each other because x equals 2 is vertical, y equals 1 is horizontal. And now over here, remember opposite reciprocals? If we look at -4, okay, let's start with opposite. This is negative, this is positive. So they are opposite signs. And remember, if we have 4, how can we write 4 as a fraction? We could put it over 1. So now if I flip that fraction, will I get the same answer as over here? Yes, I will. 4 over 1 flipped is 1/4. So these two lines are perpendicular to each other. And that's how you find perpendicular lines. You do opposite reciprocals. Okay, so if you ever have like a Hoy-Vux situation, x equals and then y equals, they'll be perpendicular to each other, so you don't even really have to do any work for those. These over here, though, you'll have to take a look at the slopes and see if it's opposite, so opposite signs, and reciprocal, so and the flip fraction. So try your turn 3, come up and check your answers, and then you can continue playing the video. All right, the last part here, we're going to do examples 4 and 5. Okay? Write an equation of a line in slope-intercept form for the line that passes through y equals 4, 5, and is parallel to the line described by y equals 5x plus 10. So this is that process. You're never going to get away from this, okay? So just get used to it. Where we have to do 1, 2, 3. We have to write the equation. Got to find the slope, find the y-intercept, plug it into the formula. We're going to do that again. Get used to this because this is going to come up a lot. Okay? So the first part, find the slope. Well, if it's parallel, okay, we want the same slope. So what is the slope of the line that we want? We want a slope of 5. Okay, so if it's parallel, we want the same slope. So both slopes are going to be 5. Now we need to find the y-intercept. So do you remember how we do that? We have y equals 5x plus b, but then we have to plug in, since we don't have b, we have to plug in x and y here. So I'm going to rewrite this. Instead of y, I'm going to write 5. Instead of x, I'm going to write 4. So I'm going to rewrite this as 5 equals 5 times 4 plus b. Now solve for b. When you solve for b, you should get 5 equals 20 plus b. You subtract 20 from both sides, and b equals negative 15. And now the last part, plug it into the formula. So go ahead and plug it into the formula. Let me know what you get. Your equation should be 5x minus 15. Please stop writing plus negative 15. If b is negative, it's minus. And just write it like that. I'm going to start taking points off if you're writing plus negative 15. Just write minus 15. Okay. And that was example 4. Now example 5. Write the equation in slope-intercept form for the line that passes through 3, 2 and is perpendicular to the line described by y equals 3x minus 1. So we do the same process. Find the slope, find the y-intercept, plug it into the formula. And what's the slope of this line originally? The original slope was 3. I'm going to write that as a fraction though, so I'm going to write 3 over 1. And now do opposite reciprocal. So opposite, change the sign. Reciprocal, flip the fraction. What's going to be the slope of our new line? Our new line is going to be negative 1/3. Okay, so because this was perpendicular, we couldn't just take the slope and be done like we did in example 4. We had to flip the fraction and change the sign. Now that we have our slope here, now we're going to find the y-intercept. So we have y equals negative 1/3 x plus b. What do I do to find b? I'm going to plug in 3 for x and 2 for y. So there's 2, there's 3. And now go ahead and solve for b and let me know what you get. Okay, for b, when you multiply this, negative 1/3 times 3 is negative 1. Then I add 1 to both sides, and I should get b equals 3. Now plug it into the formula and let me know what you get. Your equation should be y equals negative 1/3 x plus 3, because b was positive. Try your turn 4 and your turn 5, and then come check your answers, and then you can start the classwork.